It's great that everybody is already so engaged because that's what today's conference is all about. I'm Jo Boffman. I'm the Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs for the University System of Maryland, and I would like to welcome all of you here to Bowie State for our conference on taking student learning outcomes assessment to the next level, and we mean the next level. I know that we're going to get some specific thank yous later, but I would like to, on behalf of MJ Bishop, Nancy O'Neill, those two from the Kirwan Center on Academic Innovation, and Chuck Caramello, who has joined the Academic Affairs Group to work with us on graduate assessment. I'd personally like to thank them and Bowie State for hosting us today. But most of all, I would like to thank all of you, because this conference is going to be a great one because of your engagement during the day. We all know that student outcomes are really important, and we're getting some different messages. Our parents of our new students are saying, I want to know if my kid's going to get a job, and a good job, and a start on a career. So they have one picture of what it is we should be working toward. We have lots of accountability coming at us from the legislature, from the state, from the feds, from middle states. 7 of our campuses have gone through middle states accreditation in the last year and a half, and we all know they are all about assessment and outcomes. But today, we would like to look at the full range of assessing outcomes from the individual student and working toward quality and specific content outcomes from their regular curriculum, but to bring that much more broadly to figure out how we can integrate outcomes so that we do indeed not just provide our students with the right content and the A's and the B's and the C's on their transcript, but bring them to outcomes that they can then apply much more readily and easily. We want to help them connect the dots so that they see how they are being prepared for the future as well. And so today we're going to open up this conversation much more broadly about what outcomes and what assessment of student learning and student success really means. And we know we have lots of pockets of really good things going on around the system. Today's one of the chances that you will have to bring those stories forward and talk to people about them and share that learning with each other. So while all of those other groups, the parents, the students, the employers, the state, all of the accountability agencies are part of our audience, today our audience is really us. It's up to us to create and to teach ourselves and to teach each other how to improve all of these outcomes. So I would like to think of a very broad frame for today's conference, from the individual student to institutional outcomes, because as we make each one of our students more successful, our institutions, in fact, will be more successful. So once again, I welcome all of you, and now I have a real pleasure. I have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Mickey Burnham, who is the president of Bowie State, who will be leaving us relatively soon. Dr. Burnham has been here at Bowie State just over a decade, about 11 years, and I can say that Bowie State has come a very long way in those 11 years. I could give you lots of things, and I have some things in my notes, but I'm not going to take all of the time to do that. I would just like to invite Mickey up here, thank him for his service to Bowie State and the University System of Maryland, and tell you, Mickey, you've been a real class act.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, all. Good morning. I am delighted to add my words of welcome to you, to the campus of Bowie State University. We are always delighted to have guests and to host important meetings like this one. As I looked at the agenda for today's session and realized that your focus would be on assessment, an assessment of student learning and student outcomes, I was taken back to a period of about 25 years ago when I was in the South, the southern region of the country, and under SACS, the Southern Association of colleges and schools. I was very active in SACS and served on a number of commissions that looked at the standards and regulations, the core principles, et cetera, and was part of SACS movement towards assessment as being a focal point in looking at how well and determining how well higher education institutions were fulfilling their missions. Over the period of time since then, I've been able to see our world really change in important respects. Things are changing very rapidly, and we all know from reading literature on organizations and organizational change that institutions that are not growing are declining or dying. And in order to grow or to change, we need to know in what direction to grow or change. So that leads us to questions like, what has worked? What has not worked? What do we need to change in terms of approach, et cetera? So assessment has become integral, I think, to the well-being, to the success of organizations like ours, universities. And so in addition to enjoying today's session and exchanging ideas, I want to add a challenge to you to leave today's conference more determined to be an advocate and a supporter of the presidents on your campuses. I have to, I have to speak for my brother and sister presidents, to create, or I guess in most cases, to enhance and develop a culture of assessment on your respective campuses. You get it. That's why you're here as part of this conference. But a lot of our colleagues across the campuses just want to focus on their particular areas of responsibility and not really worry about filling out surveys and asking questions that might have relevance for something down the road as opposed to what I'm going to say to people in my next class. And so I simply say to you, help the president, the provost, and others inculcate in all of the members of our university communities the importance of asking those questions. What's going well? What do we need to change? How can we do it better? And of course, your focus is on student outcomes. That's really the core of what we are about. We are about the development of talents and skills in our students and creating citizens and productive persons for the workforce so that our communities, our nation, our state, and our world will be enhanced. So your opportunity is certainly a noble one, and I simply encourage you to think more broadly as you participate in today's conference and then depart from it about the role that you can play on your respective campuses. Again, welcome to Bowie State University. I wish for all of you a very enjoyable, informative, and productive session today. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Weldon Jackson, and I serve as Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Bowie State University. And I'd like to associate myself with Dr. Burnham's welcome to you. It's indeed a pleasure for us to have you on our campus. Thanks to University System of Maryland, especially the Kerwin Center for Academic Innovation and the Advisory Board for Graduate Education for organizing today's convening in partnership with us. I'm reminded of a cooking show that aired a few years ago. Some of you may have seen it. It featured this guy named Emerald. Emerald had this notion that if we want to take it up to the next level, we got to bam it. This conference is about bamming it, taking it to the next level. I'd like to recognize Bowie State's Assistant Vice President for Institutional Effectiveness, Ms. Gail Fink, and our research analyst, Mary Duppins, for hosting and coordinating the logistics for today's event. I'd also like to recognize our Assistant VP for Assessment, none other than Becky Wrzinski, for serving on the Planning Committee and coordinating the BSU panel discussion today. This is a very busy time for all of us at various universities, and Bowie State included. And I'd like to give special recognition, because we're on my home turf, to the 45 BSU faculty, staff, and administrators attending today's conference. It's a testament to the value and importance of assessment at our institution. Let me also take a moment to suggest to you that I want to speak in behalf of my fellow provosts and to thank you for your seriousness of purpose. Years ago, my daughter was asking me, "Daddy, what do you do?" So we lived in a neighborhood where there were engineers and pilots, et cetera, and I'm just a higher education administrator. She said, "Daddy, what do you do?" Then she got a little more specific. She said, "What do you make?" And I recall it as if it were yesterday, without a flinch. I said, "Baby girl, I make a difference. I try to make a difference. And in your conversation today, understand that you are difference makers. By focusing on this notion of assessment and taking assessment to the next level, you're going to make a difference in the lives of the students whom we serve." So, as a provost, and I'm not representing my group, but I will represent them. The person who represents them is Joe Boffman, but as one of the provosts in the system, let me say thank you for being difference makers, not counting it robbery to be at today's conference, to get to the nitty-gritty of what we were all about. Very proud of the strides that we've made here at Bowie, and I'm certain that your provosts are proud of the strides that you've made on your campuses, but there's always a lower deep. There's always a next level. There's always another circle that we can draw. There's always areas for improvement. So welcome to Bowie State, and have a great conversation. And to get things going in earnest, I'm going to introduce, I always want to call her PJ, but I want to introduce MJ Bishop, Director of the USM Kerwin Center for Academic Innovation. Thank you.
Very much. Good morning. Wow. Wow. 150, more than 150, something like that, Nancy, people that we have here in the room today, all to talk about the assessment, the overlooked stepchild of our otherwise really exciting initiatives, right? Right? How many here, I've been talking to folks as you've been coming in, how many here would, I think we got two types of people in the room. And some of you already know who you may be. I think we have those folks who are here because, well, assessment. We have to do it, right? Middle States is coming. Raise your hands if you're in there. Come on, don't be shy. Yeah, Larry, actually, I was looking for your hand because you made that comment earlier today. How many of you are here because, oh my gosh, assessment is so exciting. I can't wait to have this conversation today. Fiona, for a couple others. Well, our hope here today is that we'll get you all to be converts and excited about assessment in that way. Because as Larry pointed out, it is something we need to be doing and should have been doing all along. And one of the things that I think, from my perspective as director of the Kerwin Center for Academic Innovation at the system level, we can't even begin a conversation about innovation until, as Dr. Burnham and Dr. Jackson said, we know what the problems are that we're trying to solve and whether or not the innovations that we're putting into place are making a difference. So assessment is so critical to that conversation, and also to understanding whether, we're getting a return on those investments. We ask our CFOs for lots of money for these initiatives, and we need to be able to report back, yeah, it did make a difference, and we're getting a return on this because we've retained more students, we've helped them get through and been successful in their post-secondary education. So thank you all for being here. I will add my thanks to that, and I mean, really, seriously, this is exciting to have this many folks here to have this conversation. And Fiona is excited about having the assessment discussion, which is a great thing. So I also get the pleasure of having a list of thank yous to give. Of course, to our hosts, Bowie State, especially Gail Fink, Becky Vernitsky, Mary Dubbins, and all of our Bowie colleagues who made this event possible. It's really exciting to be here today. We don't often get a chance to do these events here, so thank you all for making that possible. The planning team at USM and Ed Bridge, who does an awful lot of project management work for the Kerwin Center. Nancy O'Neill, I think I'd like to give a special round of applause to her. This is really Thank you. Monica Manny, Fiona Young with Ed Bridge, Dwayne Morgan, who's here from the USM and assisting on site today. I'd also like to thank our guests. We have two great speakers that you're going to hear from shortly, Natasha Jankowski from Niloa, who actually took a red eye here today. So if at some point she just falls over, we'll just nudge her and make sure that she wakes back up. Daniel Denke, Julia Kent, Maureen McCarthy from the Council of Graduate Schools. We really appreciate having all of you here today to lend your insights to this discussion. The Planning Committee for the convening joined from the Academic Transformation Advisory Council, which is a group that we convened from the Kerwin Center, and the Advisory Board for Graduate Education that my new colleague Chuck Caramello at the System Office has been convening. Those folks have been a tremendous asset to planning this convening, and basically we're the ones that reached out to us and said, we really need to do something across the system that's focused on this assessment discussion. It's time. We need to identify who these folks are and begin collaborating on how we go about doing outcomes assessment. You're going to find the names of the program. I won't take time to read all of them now. The rest of the attack group, the Graduate Advisory Board, who shared ideas with us at several meetings, we thank all of them too for their insights and help in planning today. So a few business items. We're going to be in this building, largely the Student Center, in this ballroom. There's also a Baltimore Columbia room down the hall, that way, as I understand it, I haven't been there yet, that will have some of the day's events. We'll also be next door on the second floor, kind of in this direction, at a building called the Marshall Library Building, and there are going to be folks positioned outside to direct when we make these transitions. So hopefully nobody will get lost. Of course, if you do, come back to the registration table and somebody can give you a hand. Or you can ask one of the great Bowie students because they're all amazingly helpful, and I'm sure we'll be happy to direct you. We're going to have a beverage break here after the plenary, so take your second cup of coffee and tea with you when you go to your next session, because this is where the food will be. And let's see. I'm sorry, I'm reading those now. Apologize for that. We're also going to have a beverage break at 2 o'clock. That'll be set up here and inside the special collections room over in the library building, which is room 2202. That surprises me. Usually the special collections people don't like the food in there. So,
They don't.
Don't spill anything. They don't. Please don't spill anything in the special collections room. If you listen to a dietary need, look for Fiona. Is Fiona back in the back room? Fiona Young, not there. This Fiona. Fiona Young with Ed Bridge. Fiona can help you out with getting your lunchtime needs taken care of. Also, Fiona is going to be helping with folks who are proposing special roundtable discussions. She can help coordinate that and make sure you get to the right table and have a table tent and so forth. There's also going to be a sign-up sheet for that at the registration table. So if you have a burning topic you would like to lead during lunch, we can have you lead your own roundtable and get a group together to talk about that. We're going to reconvene here at the end of the day for a short but really important session. One of the things that Chuck and I and Dr. Boffman, Joe Boffman, are really hoping to come away with today is an understanding of what the next steps should be. How do we continue this conversation? How does the USM support your efforts to take it to the next level, bam, with student learning outcomes assessment. So as tempting as it will be at 3:30 when we break to come back here, for you to hit the road and beat the traffic, we'd really like you to come back and help us figure out what we can do to support your efforts. I think it'll be worthwhile, of course for us, but also for you in helping to guide us as we move this conversation forward. We're also going to have an evaluation for you to complete. It'll be online. The URL is up there at the bottom on the screen. So please do send your feedback. This will be on the screen again at the end of the day as well, so that you'll actually have something to say by then. Okay, I think that's it. Did I cover everything, Nancy, on the logistics? We do have a Twitter handle, too, for those of you who are tweeting. Hashtag USM Assessment 2017. Get the word out on the great things you're hearing about today. So, okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Chuck Caramello. Chuck is the new Senior Advisor for Graduate Education at the University System of Maryland, and it's been a huge pleasure to have him join us there. And as you can see here, the benefits of having him as part of the system office in terms of this discussion today. So Chuck's going to introduce our keynote speakers.
Thank you. Now I'm going to follow your lead.
Okay.
Be more informal about this. So first of all, let me add my thanks to MJ's Bowie for hosting this, to the planning group, to speakers, and to all of you attendees. When we first had this idea, we've been planning two separate things, it turned out. That MJ and Nancy had been planning a convening on undergraduate assessment, and the graduate deans in the system had been planning a meeting on graduate assessment. And we thought, well, we should somehow coordinate these, and then we thought, well, do we really want to ask people to drive someplace twice in the same semester? And in any case, intellectually, these two things really belong together. And that's very much one of the themes of the day. So, in order to advance that idea, we decided we would do this together and talk about learning outcomes assessment, basically from general education up through doctoral and professional training. So it's an interesting concept. We're very interested in the articulation of these two things, and it really it's a flow with master's programs kind of in the middle. So again, thanks. It's been a great pleasure to work with MJ, Nancy, Annika, and Fiona, and I want to thank you all for being such terrific collaborators. So, it's almost certain that everyone in this room, at some point, made the epistemic shift from teaching to learning. The shift from understanding higher education as a unidirectional process of professors teaching students to understanding higher education as a multi-directional process of students learning from faculty and from each other. And the beauty of this shift is it doesn't exchange one perspective for the other. We didn't suddenly jump from everything from the faculty point of view to everything from the student point of view. It was really a shift that began to see the whole learning process as an interplay of both of these perspectives. It's almost as certain that everyone in the room at some subsequent point experienced an aha moment. And the aha moment in this context is when we recognized that learning was simultaneously a process and an outcome. Okay. An outcome that comprises in turn a multitude of constituent processes and outcomes. And B, that all of these outcomes are open to methods of assessment. which is designed to confirm not only if the desired learning has occurred, but how to improve it going forward, how to improve the process. And I'll risk sounding like a cult leader, we all came to embrace learning outcomes assessment. As, if not salvation, a critical component of higher education. We've come together today, though, not to congratulate ourselves on our collective insight, but rather to discuss how to move learning outcomes assessment to the next levels. The Kerwin Center for Academic Innovation has been at the forefront of learning outcomes assessment for USM, and particularly at the undergraduate, but not exclusively at the undergraduate levels. The USM Advisory Council for Graduate Education, which is really to say the body of graduate deans, has made a commitment to supporting learning outcomes assessment for all USM master's, doctoral, and professional programs, so hence our joining together. We joined in organizing today's convening as the first system-wide conversation on learning outcomes assessment at different levels of institutional progress. We recognize that everybody is at a different level, and so the point is not to rise to one level, but for everybody to get to the next level from where they are now. And also to talk about assessment at different levels, degree levels. Again, we've tended to, it's evolved from really secondary education up through higher education and is now a K-20 initiative. So most of the day will be focused on specific aspects of learning outcomes assessment, particularly in the context of USM institutions. Our keynote speakers, though, will set a broad context and raise some broader questions, challenges, and opportunities. So it's now my pleasure, on behalf of Vice Chancellor Hoffman, MJ, myself, and the rest of the planning team, to introduce Drs. Jankowski and Deneke. So I will introduce them both very quickly, and then they'll come up in turn and speak, and then have a panel discussion. So, Natasha Jankowski is the director of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment and a research assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. As director of NILOA, Dr. Jankowski regularly presents at national conferences on outcomes assessment and has authored and co-authored numerous reports and papers on the subject, including Making Student Learning Evidence Transparent, the State of the Art, and Using Assessment Results, Promising Practices of Institutions that Do It Well. Her research interests include assessment and evaluation, organizational evidence use, and evidence-based storytelling. Dr. Jankowski holds a PhD in higher education from the University of Illinois. And prior to joining NILOA, she worked for Gear Up Learning Centers at Western Michigan University and with the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, studying community colleges and public policies. So, Natasha, thank you for joining us. Second, my colleague from CGS, Daniel Deneke, is Vice President of Best Practices and Strategic Initiatives at the Council of Graduate Schools. He is also the managing editor of the CGS Best Practices monograph series, which now has over 50 titles in print. Since joining CGS in 2012, Dr. Deneke has led projects and authored publications on a range of graduate education topics, including research and scholarly integrity, international collaboration, professional development for non-academic careers, although we prefer multiple career paths. These are non-academic, these are multiple career paths. PhD future, PhD completion and attrition, and the integration of undergraduate outcomes assessment into preparing future faculty programs. Dr. Denicky received his PhD in English from Johns Hopkins University and previously served as a faculty member at Georgetown University and the University of Maryland at College Park. So with that, let me turn things over to Natasha and welcome our two speakers.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I am very excited to be here and talk about assessment because I love it. And I also really like the idea of taking this to the next level. So I'm going to talk about a lot of things in a short amount of time. And the goal is sort of to blow your mind, but give you some perspective for the rest of the day and thinking about sort of where we've been, where we're going, and how all of this can fit together and impact our work in that space. And thank you, Fiona. So are you guys familiar with the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment? Have you noticed? Okay, I'll give you a quick overview for those that don't. It's easy to remember NOLOA if you think it's like Hawaiian sounding. It's like, yeah, we're making assessment really fun. But we are incredibly Midwestern, so we're based at the University of Illinois and Indiana University, but we were formed in 2008 really in a two-part purpose to be a research resource institute. So look nationally at what are people doing in relation to assessing student learning, what's working, what's not, and turn that into meaningful resources for people to help them advance their work and their efforts. If you are looking for a how-to guide or the 5 steps to follow where you too will have an amazing assessment process, you're gonna hate our materials. So I'll just be upfront with you so you know what you're getting into. It's a lot of principles, it's reflective questions, it's guiding thoughts, because local practice matters, culture matters, and the institutional history that you've had with assessment is going to impact whatever you're trying to do. And so being very mindful and aware of that I think is important. Everything that I'm going to tell you about is also available on our website. All of our materials are open for anyone to use in pretty much whatever way you'd like. And if you want updates, if you're like, oh, I love assessment and I want to hear about it, join our email list. We send, I swear, 1 email a month, so we aren't going to overwhelm you or send you lots of things in that sense. Also, if this is a dialogue for us, so if you are looking on our website for a specific resource and we don't have it, there's a topic there that you need that we don't address, let us know, and we are happy to try to fill that gap, but we don't know if you don't tell us about it. So please think of this more as an invitation to a conversation than something else. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about something that I like to call the assessment cube of misunderstanding that comes out of a lot of our work that we see. And part of this is related to the institutional history that we all have with assessment. Part of this is sort of forgetting that assessment is a field that moves. And a lot of times we search for the right way to do it or have someone just tell us how we can get it done. But it's too complicated, and that's okay. So think about this sort of as a prism in some ways as we move through this conversation. But you heard already there's multiple levels at which we can assess, right? I can look at things in a course, I can think about a program, I can look at my undergrad, I can look at graduate level. I might have different meanings or why I'm engaging with it. So I'm doing this because I'm interested in improvement or I want it for some other reasons. And each of those, there's huge differences in definitions. We were connected in K-12. Most people think about assessment in K-12 as testing. So if you have faculty members that are like, you want me to do what? Like, I'm not standardizing this. Like, there's a history there that these comes from. And all of these things relate to places where people struggle. And so it's thinking about behind each of those sort of elements that lead to misunderstandings are theories that we don't really talk about and assumptions in play that can trip up our work. So what I'd like to sort of have is give some framing and some different ways of seeing what's happening behind those scenes there. So as you're going throughout today and you're hearing people talk, think about the lens that you bring to it, but also where are they coming from? And then as you're navigating on your campuses, how do these things sort of fit together? Because behind all this are theories on how students learn, what their role is, what our role is, how these pieces fit together, what the best way or the right way to go about doing these things are. And really then also thinking about how are we making those arguments? That we either are improving learning or being accountable or we're doing the things that we think matter. What's the evidence that's backing that up? And everyone sort of has different conceptions of what counts and what doesn't in that space. So I want you to be thinking about those pieces. Because a lot of times what we see happen, and I run into this a lot when I'm out and about, is it's just people arguing with each other and talking past each other. And we're in a place where if we are really taking this to the next level, we need to be able to talk with in a way that's very meaningful and understanding of that space. So let me give you 4 schools of thought that I think are pretty common that we see that might help as lenses. And I'm chunking these in ways, there's a lot more interaction. For the purpose of this, I'm going to break them into sort of 4 distinct areas. But one is measurement. And this is really coming if you're having a conversation with a faculty member and they're like, I love what you're saying, but the N is too small, so I'm sorry, I can't do anything with that data. You're talking to a measurement person, okay? There's a lot of focus here on how can we make this as like science-focused as possible. So you see a lot of like validity, reliability studies. That's really the concern in assessment. How are we getting that sample of the student work from throughout the campus and thinking about that? And none of these are right or wrong, but they're definitely just ways that we approach it. There's a lot of sort of like, well, I gave them a pre when they came in, and now I'm looking at the post. I need comparative data. That's something that's really important. And you see things that come out to address this, like there was a value report that was released on Solid Ground looking at the multi-state collaborative work. This report is written for measurement people. Like, that's what it's all about. It's like, how did we do this sample? How did this work? Why can we say this is reliable? What can you use the data for and not? So if you're like, oh, I care about teaching and learning, and you get into that report, it's not for you. So pass it to your measurement people. But that's definitely a place where we get conversations. There's a lot of dialogue happening, and it's really hard for someone that's coming from that perspective to talk with others that have a different lens. Another lens that's incredibly common is compliance. And this is like, we have to do it. Somebody told us we had to. They're coming. We need to get it done. Just tell me what you need me to do. This is the student in your class that's like, how many pages is this paper, right? How many references do I have to have in here for this to be done? And then I'm good, and I can like move on, and there's a checklist sort of thing to move on. You also hear where it's bureaucratic. If someone's talking about this is divorced from my teaching and learning process, this is an add-on to my work, you're probably getting a signal that this is the value and the purpose of this has been framed as it's about compliance. It's an add-on. Most of the time it's about reporting. You may see a cycle that looks something like this. Is your assessment cycle, where it's like, oh, it's about sort of packaging our data, submitting our report, and then we start that again the next time. We do a lot of work looking at websites, and I can tell you based on the last time the assessment information was updated when they went through their accreditation cycle. Like, it's pretty consistently spot on. But that can be really detrimental to what we're trying to do and making that difference and being those change agents and helping our students learn, because it's a report that goes nowhere, and the people that you need to be engaged are now disengaged, because what's the value in that? And this is just a bureaucratic exercise. And so, I mean, I can totally understand that. If this is where you are, and you're struggling with that, we have a book for you. And this was really the purpose of we wrote a book in, I think, 2015 on using evidence, and it was to help people move from a compliance to an improvement mentality and rethink how we've organized ourselves around reporting. Because most of the first takes of institutional processes have been in this lens. And it's really hard to change. If you think about change moves at the speed of trust, if you've been working in the accreditation environment, there's not a lot of trust. 80% of institutions get dinged on assessment, 80% when they go back up. And then you get told by your accreditors, no, do it in a mission way, make sure it makes sense for you, and then they just dinged you because you weren't doing it right? Like, that's mixed signals, like crazy. Someone needs to have a communication conversation there. Part of that's peer review, part of that's larger issues, part of that's our inability to tell our narrative and explain the why we're doing the things that we are. But I'm happy to send you this book. All our materials are free. I'm not going to make you buy a book. So if you want a copy of this, if that's going to be helpful where you are, just give me your card and where to mail it to, and I'll send you one. Another one that we hear a lot is a much more sort of vocationalization of our education process. Right? Like, we need to fill employer gaps, fill the skills gap. I'm not even wording this right. But you're thinking like pipeline, talent pipeline management, things in those areas. And there are good and bad parts of this, but it's sort of like learning didn't count unless an employer validated it, is where you get into some of this area. This is more professional schools and things of that nature. But very much a value-added piece. Was it is it their return on investment in a way that matters externally for those groups? But in each of those 3 mindsets and sort of talking about it, I don't know if you noticed, but there were no students. And in thinking about assessment and learning, it's really the students. And historically, yes, assessment has been something that we've done to our students, not with them. We wrote learning outcome students for ourselves, not for our students. Most of them don't even know about it. Or it was on the syllabus the first day and you mentioned it like in passing, and then it never comes back up again. You're like, I told them, it's cool. Like, don't worry about it. But it's really important as we're thinking about this and as you're moving through and engaging in an assessment practice, if we are taking it to that next level, we have to unpack the assumptions that we have at play about our students. A great example of this is a campus we were working with, high commuter population, very urban. and students started showing up regularly 10 minutes late to class. We were there for a different thing, and we're doing focus groups with students. But we were talking with the faculty beforehand, and they were like, I don't know what you want me to do if I can't teach students that aren't engaged and aren't motivated and don't want to be here. And we were sort of going, like, you realize that large numbers of your students just like stopped showing up, like there's something going on here, but you went with motivation. Like, good job, you. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we were doing focus groups with students, asked them what was going on, and the city bus schedule changed, right? This tells me several things. One, this campus did not know their student population, right? Two, that's an administrative issue that's easily fixed. But three, that's something the faculty believed about those students before. Right? The fact that the students started showing up late proved their point. They already felt that about the students. Students know when you don't care. Students know, like, immediately when you're in a class if they value, if they feel that, if they're part of it or not. And I think part of the thing that we need to remember, especially in assessment as it gets wider and broader and we're thinking about all those levels at which it can happen, is every person is an educator and every person can make or break a student. And if we are about learning, then it's all the spaces and opportunities in which learning can happen, and we can't privilege some over others. We need to be very mindful of that space. So one other way that we see sort of a lens to think about this is one that's very much focused on that this is about students and their learning and understanding where that's happening, and not sort of going, there's the programmatic approach to assessment where we're like, well, we looked at them here and then we looked at the capstone project and like half of them got it and half of them didn't, like good luck, happy graduation. Now we're gonna make changes for the next group of students that comes through. And like, I don't know if that's fair. There's a lot of things we can do along the way to make sure students get there. But this is much more a focus that's about pedagogy, it's about improvement, it's about meeting our students where they are, it's very formative, it's about feedback. Feedback only works if students have an opportunity to do something with it. If you give them feedback at the end and you're like, have fun reading that on your own, it's not, the learning isn't gonna happen. So it's being very intentional about that, and also understanding that it's for individual students. Every student that we touch, we're getting into a conversation at that point. So you have a cycle that looks more like this, which I think is happier looking. I feel like there should be a smiley face in here. But it's really thinking more, and it starts to integrate those conversations that we're having on our campus about how does this relate to retention? How does this connect to graduation? How does this help with our student success? If we're doing pathways, how do these pieces fit together? Because it's about those larger success strategies for our students as learners and thinking about it in that way. So that's just another lens to take a look. But the other thing that this does is it helps us realize that there are pieces of our students' experience that involve learning that we don't capture. So for example, we were working with a campus with their assessment committee, and we got there and the career services department like cornered me and was like, can you get me into the assessment meeting? I was like, I'm pretty sure it's an open committee and you can just come in. Like, I don't have to like break you in through a window. But their concern was they'd submitted their report, and the committee was like, no, we're good. Like, we got your report, you're totally fine, right? Because that process had been about reporting. Career Services has mock interview data. They ask students, give me an example of a time you did X. Tell me about an instance of when you did Y. They have data on where a student says they learned something, right? There's no mechanism to feed that back into the curriculum, but that's a hugely important curriculum conversation. If you have faculty map a curriculum and the learning outcomes, and you have students map it, the maps do not look the same. Spoiler alert, I'm sorry. You're like, surprise. So I think that's a wonderful way to think about where are those places that because of the lens we've brought to our assessment, we've missed evidence that we had, and we've missed connection points and opportunity. Another one is thinking about, a lot of times we're like, oh, employers, we need our employers to care. How do we partner with employers? And we forget like we are an employer as higher ed. We have tons of people that work for us, and we have needs and all of these things. But we also have students that work on our campus. Iowa Grow is a project that was also done in Wisconsin. It's the We Grow. Where they had, if you were an on-campus, if you were a student working on campus, they had 4 reflective questions that they asked once a month. That was basically, what are you learning in work that applies to your classes, and what are you learning in your classes that apply to your work? Because transference, the hardest thing for students. What I learned here, I can use over here, and making those connections. But we've never asked them, right? It's very compartmentalized. I have my work schedule, I have my class schedule, I have all these different pieces. So when they first asked the students are like, I don't know, nothing, right? Why are you asking me this? Like, can I go back to work? But as you ask and you start thinking about it, they got incredibly reflective, and we're starting to make those connections, which is also beneficial for them to be able to talk to employers about what they can and can't do. So that solves multiple problems for us. So I think it's thinking about the opportunities and the spaces that we have in different ways. And just to remind you that I think don't do a bus. I don't want to be on your campus and we're having a conversation and you're like, I have these bizarre thoughts about my students, which are important to unpack and have that conversation about. How do you think about your students and why? And are these things that are right? Because we spend a lot of time designing things for people without checking with them. And we have good intentions most of the time. But we can make something that we think is a beautiful path of learning and our students move through it like this because we never talked with them. And so I think it's just, as you're going throughout today and you're getting really good ideas and you're thinking about it, also remember, how are we going to involve the students and how can we make those connections? One other piece that I think has been a conversation that's lacking, so if we're taking this to the next level, let's bring this conversation to the table, is what's the relationship between equity and assessment? So we launched a paper in January, and I invite everyone into dialogue on this. We've invited people to sort of respond to it and get the conversation going, because we've talked about it in the testing world, but not in assessment as a process of thinking about our learning, right? Because do we have to demonstrate learning in a particular way, or is it that you just need to demonstrate your learning? How are we thinking about the role of culture as a part of this? What's the relationship there? How do these pieces fit together? Are we privileging certain types of learning over others? Is it you had to do it my way and then I validate it? Or how are we sending signals about what counts and what's in and what's not? And thinking about that in relation to our assessment, which is, again, a hard conversation, but a very needed one if this is really about our students and the learning and what we're trying to do as educational institutions. If we want to make that difference, it's making the difference for everyone. So thinking about that in meaningful ways. So you may have noticed, and by the way, my background is in philosophy, and I think assessment is applied philosophy. So anytime, if you have problems with your philosophy group, call me, and I'll be like, it's about knowledge, guys. How do you know if you know? This is epistemology. We should be owning this as philosophers. But I think part of it is that we need to have, in assessment, we have this long history of the doing. We had to do it. Somebody was coming, we just had to figure it out, and we just had to write some outcomes, we had to get it in place, we had to have plans, we just had to do. And we haven't had a lot of space for reflection. We haven't had a lot of space for dialogue on those really important questions. There are ethical issues, there are ontological issues, who are our learners, what counts as learning, all of these pieces. And each of those different lenses that I mentioned of the four have parts behind them that we haven't really had that crosstalk about. But it also, now that you sort of see those lenses, I hope, positions you when you go back to your campus to understand as you're navigating how the people you're talking with, what that lens they're coming from, and how you need to respond or think about reframing or engage them in that dialogue as well. Because they're beliefs. And it's really, we can't not have a conversation about assessment without getting into beliefs about learning, our learners, and our roles in our institutions. And these are big, important conversations and necessary ones to have. But yes. So if you haven't also noticed, it's a field that moves. It's a discipline in a lot of ways. We learn, we shift, we change trajectory. We've been doing national surveys every 4 years, and it looks different, which is good. I would get really bored if it was oh, they're doing the same thing. Everybody's giving a CLA. But I think we need to be aware of how what we are trying to do in this space is different from things that have happened before, because we have institutional histories and we have faculty that remember. And if we aren't having that conversation of the value and the purpose and the why and what this is and what this isn't, then we run into a lot of additional misunderstandings that can block our ability to go forward because people remember what happened before. They'll be like, oh, we did that. And it was a waste of everyone's time. And now you have to get buy-in, which sounds like you're selling something to people, and nobody likes that. But also a quick note on the faculty side of things. Most of the time, when we talk with faculty, everyone's like, oh, faculty, they complain about everything, they don't want to do anything. And when we talk with them, they have really solid objections. This form doesn't capture what I'm doing in my class. That's not I don't want to do assessment. That's not I don't care about teaching and learning. That's you're not capturing what I'm doing. And I'm not okay with that. And most of the time, those are very doable things to engage in, but we sort of have this mentality that faculty are complainers, and so we miss what they're actually talking to us about. So just as a side note, if that's you, you know who you are. But it also talks a bit to, if you've noticed, that what we need to then do in assessment, and as people that get it and see it, is you're change makers, and you have to sort of traverse an organization. So I wrote a paper with a colleague of mine, Ruth Slotnick, on what are the essential roles of an assessment practitioner. And what's the balance, right? Because while not everyone's going to have all of these, at different points in time, you need different ones to come to the forefront. And I think the ones that we've seen the most in recent times is the political navigator and the being able to cross those boundaries and speak in different ways, different groups, in a questioning dialogue of what questions do you have, why are we engaging with this, what does this look like? But if we can't sort of create that space, but also in terms of the narrative and the translation, we're going to have a hard time taking these things to scale and taking them in a way that really moves our field in that sense. So I want to move into just a little bit about how do we get there and how do we talk about this work before passing this over to Daniel. And one of them is evidence-based storytelling. I know it's not, you can call it whatever you want. It's not the title that matters, it's the thing. So when we were looking at institutions that were really good at using assessment results, because that's where everyone, like, you guys feel good, you're like, I use results, it's awesome, change. No, we're good. Okay, so community of practice, we just made one. And it's hard. Most of it's because the data that we were collecting was for something else. It wasn't to be used. It wasn't to address the questions that we had, right? If you're in that compliance part, like, I'm not surprised. You used it in a report. Good job. That's what you made the system to do. So you won. Nice. But the rest of it for like change and improvement, what we miss in there is part of the why we're getting into it and how can we talk about it. So in evidence-based storytelling, it's really thinking about evidence very broadly defined, wide range of what counts as evidence that's about our students' learning, that we're making in support of claims or arguments about how we're either being accountable or we're improving, that we tell through stories to persuade a specific audience. And I think in assessment, we've forgotten the fact that's like a key thing of any writing assignment is you have to give students an audience to write to, right? Otherwise, they're writing to paper to you as a faculty member, and that's just kind of weird. But we don't pick the audiences to communicate this work to, and we're in a huge narrative problem in terms of we don't have good counter narratives. We can't explain to people what we're doing, even internally to our campus. We can't even talk in that sense and move around. So it's not just a needing to help us tell our stories, but also our students to tell the story of their learning and where they've gotten things and where they haven't. Because what that allows us to do is really have a sense as we move forward of that culture piece of what does good assessment look like for us here? Why do we do the things that we do? What's the benefit of that? And why do we do that and not something else? So what is it for us that fits into our process? It's about who we are, that fits the things that we care about, that sparks joy for us in our learning with our learners, and that's what matters. Because a lot of the times we have this just sort of, well, they come and then learning happens and it's great. And like, that doesn't work. We need to figure out what our collective sense of that is. And part of that is because we have a history of we want to make causal statements. We want to say that because of us, something happened, right? I pulled this lever and balloons came, right? We want to do that. We want to say I had these institutional structures, support, courses, students, and it came to this learning. We can't. I'm sorry, like put it in a balloon of sadness, we'll let it go together in the parking lot, but like we just can't make those causal statements because life happens, our students move, we make small changes in a course that add up to large changes over time, we make programmatic gen ed changes and then people bring that in different ways. There's just so many different places in there. We can't make it, but we don't need to make causal arguments. We need to make theoretical arguments or theories of change arguments in that sense. So, surprise, I'm a philosopher. Toolman is a person that's really helpful in this because what we've done is, forget the warrant part for a minute, is we've said we have all this evidence, so we're good, right? We've got evidence straight to claim. We're like, here's a bunch of data, here's a bunch of information. If you want it, I'll just give it to you. And that's either why we're being accountable or we're improving. What we've left out is the warrant, which is the why. Why does this stuff happen? Why is this evidence an instance that we've done this? Why this and not something else? It's that why piece that we can't talk about and we don't have spaces for. Because we need to make arguments about why the things that we're doing we think will lead to better outcomes, will lead to better student learning, will engage in that process and be able to have that conversation much more meaningfully. So for instance, how many of you guys feel like your students are writers that are awesome writers? All right, we got another community effect. Okay, we're good. We're finding synergies here. I think this is good. So we work a lot with the campuses, and we hear like, oh, our students aren't writing well. I know. We need to cover it more. So we're going to just put it in more classes, and we're going to add a course on it, and then student writing will improve, right? Behind that is the idea that like learning happens in a course, or that if you're not getting enough, like you need to cover it more. None of these are right or wrong, but they are sort of, there's a theory that's happening behind there of how students learn, what they need, how to help them. Another one we hear is, okay, our students aren't writing well. I know, we have an awesome writing center. We will tell the students of the Writing Center, they will go and make use of the Writing Center, writing will improve, right? We all know the problems with that. The students that need it the most aren't going to be the ones that aren't going to engage with it and sort of all those pieces, but there's that idea behind it. I will tell them of the opportunities, they will use it and go. One that we hear a lot recently is, I will make very clear intentional pathways of learning. I will make it very clear at the end where they're going, and students will see where they're going, and they will get there faster and jump higher, and it'll be a wonderful experience for everyone involved. And none of these work for some students, and they don't work for others. But the point is, we need to know what's behind that, and what are those assumptions at play? Does that work? Does that not? Does that fit us and our students? Does that fit our culture? Is that going to work for us here? And get into that conversation, because each of those talk about the root cause for the thing that we're seeing. So when you're thinking about and listening to the assessment conversations today, keep that in mind also with the lens piece. So what are those lenses, but also what are the assumptions, what are those root causes, and how does that relate and can it take back to your campus? And ask those questions when you're engaging in dialogue. And the reason that this is important, well, there's a variety of reasons this is important, but I think the one that I'll tell you right now is I travel a lot. I just took the red eye, woohoo, came to California, time zones are crazy. And I always have the conversation with the seat partner, right? That's what are you traveling for, work or business? Or work or business, apparently that's all I travel for. There's no fun. No fun, just work or business. And my short airplane, what is NOLOA, is I work at this place that we study how do you know if students learned anything in college. It's my short blurb. Without fail, they're oh, I didn't learn a thing in college. Wow, I was sick for really long years, still paying it off, it sucks. And of course, my heart is broken every time. But as any good qualitative researcher, I ask additional questions, we engage in a dialogue, and it turns out that they actually know all kinds of stuff. They have great quantitative reasoning skills, they have really great leadership and teamwork skills, they can do oral communication, they're civically engaged, and I'm wonderful, so tell me about how you got that. And they feel they got it in spite of us, right? Which is good to know, but part of that is we never told them. We never told them that that's what we were going for. We were never transparent in our design. We never gave that, this is why I'm asking you to take this course, or why I'm asking you to do this assignment, or why I'm asking you to engage in this experience. Because this is what it does. This is the kind of person we're going for. Our learning outcomes are statements of aspiration for the people we're helping create, right? That's beautiful and exciting. That's way better than something I have to measure because somebody told me to. But that's also a huge issue, right? Because if we are getting questions about our worth and our graduates don't even know, that's a huge problem. We have tons of students that leave that can't talk about that can't advocate on our behalf, that can't speak about their learning, that then move on and don't know what they got and don't know where they are. And so then that's a simple fix. This is a communication issue in a lot of ways. So all of this work is very important, I think, in that space. But don't worry, there's hope. And we will have lots of conversations throughout today. If you're freaking out at this point, don't worry. We've got this. I got resources for you. It's going to be totally fine. And so I'll be doing assignment work later. And there's an excellence assessment. So if you're how do I talk about this in narrative? Find me at lunch. We'll have that conversation. I'll help you out with that. But websites are here, email, any questions that you have or anything like that. But I hope that's a useful kind of framing for pieces and things to think about. And I know it's a lot and it's big, but if we're taking it to the next level, you guys got to bring it. So we're going bigger. I'm going home. So I'm not. I'm actually going to another one after this. But anyway, Daniel, I will pass this to him for the sort of next view of where we're going.
So thank you, Natasha, for such a capacious framework. I think after seeing and listening to Natasha, I'm going to be more of the sort of provocateur. And part of that is because in some sense I'm a little bit of an outsider. I think Natasha and Niloa have real expertise in learning outcomes assessment, and not to disavow our experience at the Council of Graduate Schools, but we have a slightly different perspective on this, and we've been working very closely with graduate deans to see how graduate schools and graduate deans can help advance this work. So a lot of the rest of the day for you will focus on the kind of how-to, the nuts and bolts, and yes. Oh, might be better, okay. And where would I? Okay. Let's see, is that good? Can everybody hear me? Okay. So much will be focused on the how-to, the nuts and bolts, and I'm really going to sort of step back and ask what I think are some of the big important questions. And I want to precede this with two anecdotes, and they stem from my own personal teaching. And as Chuck mentioned, I had the pleasure of teaching a seminar here at the University of Maryland, College Park, on the Victorian novel. I'd been teaching for about 7 years at different campuses, and I will say that the experience here was very rewarding at College Park, was very rewarding for one particular reason, which is that many of my students were more adult learners than I'd been accustomed to. Many of them were paying their own way, which was not the student population that I was accustomed to working with from my other campus experiences. And also that in the teaching and then in the dialogue, and this was sort of before, for me, at the age of student learning outcomes, and I'd given a lot of thought about what I want my students to achieve and what I want them to learn. But what I hadn't expected was the sort of level of personal experience, the amount of personal experience that students would bring into the dialogue about what was being taught. And I think anybody who's worked with adult learners know that this is an element of teaching with adult learners. But I think it also brings up one of the questions for us as we're thinking about, are we talking about student outcomes for what? Is it for their jobs? That's already been mentioned, the importance of careers. Is it for the major? Do we want them to advance into the major? I think some people acknowledging the importance of general education may kind of secretly harbor a desire that every student goes into their own discipline, becomes a major, maybe goes on to graduate school. And so we think of general skills, but are we also thinking about sort of the civil and the civic and the private components that students are often coming to the subjects for, and are those reflected in our outcomes? And so just one of the questions that I sort of would begin with is outcomes for what? Is it for the course, the major, the job, or is it for personal enrichment? For some of these students, it's really about for personal enrichment, and how are we in dialogue with that? The second anecdote comes from another campus, very different, where I would venture to say very few students were paying their own way, much more expensive campus, more prestigious in some ways, I guess some would say, but one of the students that I had there, and this was the first time in 7 years, it was what I would call the so what student. And I don't know how many of you have had a so what student, but this was the first day of class. About every 10 minutes of the first class of the semester, the student would say, well, so what? So what? So why does this matter? And as someone who thinks about curricular design and thinks about even why I would structure a course or propose a course in the first place, I really respected the question. As someone who's trying to get a course up and running to encounter this every 10 minutes, it becomes a kind of obstruction. And it made, again, this was for me personally before the age of student learning outcomes. And so it made me think, if we had, in retrospect, if we had a very clearly defined set of learning outcomes, to what extent should we be able at every moment in our class freeze the class and say, okay, so what exactly am I trying to do in this moment in a seminar format or in a lecture format that aligns with a very particular predefined outcome that I would like the student to have, so that I could answer that so what question at any moment in the class. There's a very good justification that is part of our goal here. But the provocateur in me wonders, knowing how many experiences have come out of my teaching and others, in dialogue with others about teaching, how many experiences have come out of a teaching moment that causes the teacher to realize that they're teaching things they hadn't intended in the first place, and they're making a difference. They're changing lives. They have students coming up to them saying, this moment in class that you didn't necessarily even intend has caused me to rethink my whole life, whether it's a job or civil or civic identity or personal identity or revelation. So one of the questions that I would just have is about the so what moment is like, okay, now we have learning outcomes, so what do we do with them? To what extent are we really going back and making sure every moment of our class aligns with one of those outcomes? Is there room for indeterminacy? Is there room for innovation in action in this definite work that we're doing to define and use student learning outcomes? So, as I said, we're not exactly experts in learning outcomes assessment. We have worked with graduate deans who have really worked with faculty to try to get the ball rolling in many respects about graduate outcomes assessment and to define graduate learning outcomes and to get faculty to start thinking about using them. I'll mention a number of projects, some of which actually dovetail with the doctoral level or directly sort of head-on address the doctoral level question about to what extent are we doing this with our PhDs and our professional doctorates. But we've also worked with undergraduates through our projects, and so I'm going to describe a little bit about how we've done that. Just to give you a sense of who CGS is, we're a member organization. We have 500 U.S. Universities with additional members internationally. Many of you are members of CGS, whether you know it or not. Our primary representatives at the campus are graduate schools and graduate deans, but we have member services that are available to many of you. Our mission is to advance and improve graduate education and research, and we do that through advocacy on policy issues. We do that through research on graduate education and through best practices. So what I'm going to describe is 3 best practice initiatives that all, I think, have implications for the discussions that you're going to have today. The first is preparing future faculty to assess student learning. This was a 3-year project funded by the Teagle Foundation and the Sloan Foundation. The project really addresses the fact that one of the most important things that we can be doing as faculty is to understand to what extent our classrooms are producing learning. And so assessment is the key sort of strategy for figuring out whether what we're trying to teach or produce in our learners is actually taking place. And yet many faculty are expected to start participating in this process without any experience about how to do this. And so our kind of hypothesis in this project was if we actually address graduate students who are aspiring to faculty positions before they enter their faculty responsibilities, not only will we potentially overcome some of this resistance based on, well, I know what this is all about, we did this before, it's an accreditation accountability movement, and we'll do checkboxes, and we'll do rubrics, and blah, blah, blah. We'll reach people when they're really struggling with, okay, I'm struggling with how to define their identity as future faculty members, understanding that this is a responsibility, but it's also an opportunity to really do deep thinking, I guess philosophical thinking, about what they're trying to achieve as in this professional capacity as professors, as teachers, and as facilitators of learning. So through the project, graduate students who aspire to faculty positions learn to identify needs and opportunities in their classroom and in their programs. For example, gateway courses, we were looking at things like gateway courses and when do students actually kind of tune out in a gateway course, and if so, why? To respond to those needs through enhanced teaching and learning techniques, and to engage with other graduate students and faculty in evidence-based conversations within and across the arts and sciences. You can see our research partners in this project were 7. We had Cornell University, Harvard University, Michigan State, Indiana, NCA&T and UNC Greensboro partnered together in a kind of consortium, and we worked with University of California, Merced, who actually had learning assessment in their strategic mission from the very inception of the institution. The goal of the project was really, there are these preparing future faculty type programs and CERTL programs all across the country. The goal of this project was really to ensure that each of these programs is sort of infused and imbued with learning assessment strategies and evidence-based learning. And that's sort of a next step for many of these programs. So I guess the plenary title is Past, Present, and Future. So the past of this is just sort of what were the conditions for this project. And I think you've already heard a little bit of this from Natasha. Accrediting bodies, as many of you know, have given heightened attention to student learning outcomes. It's the number one thing upon which universities are dinged. But it's not just having student learning outcomes, it's really now, are you using them and how are you using them? That's the thing that they're increasingly coming back to universities for. We had, at an annual meeting of CGS, we had Erwin Chemerinsky. I don't know how many of you know him, but he's sort of an expert on affirmative action and admissions policies. And his message to the graduate deans in the audience were like, you know, a lot of you are listening to your lawyers, as you should, but a lot of your lawyers are pretty risk averse. And his main message was that you all could be a little less risk averse, take a little more risk in this area. And I think when I hear how the cycle is going between accreditors dinging universities for not meeting standards that they haven't necessarily articulated, and they're looking for more faculty engagement and more buy-in and more innovation, I think there's a little bit of the cart driving the horse here, and that there's just more room for risk and innovation, and that the way in which that's going to happen is greater involvement of faculty and greater engagement of students. And it was nice to hear Natasha mention students, because that will be sort of a theme throughout the lessons I'll draw here. So among these conditions, faculty were required to document learning out objectives in new ways, unfamiliar to prior generations. They weren't necessarily given training in this. There was vigorous debate, as has already been noted, around instruments and approaches that some faculty saw as bureaucratic, maybe not necessarily attuned to their discipline. Jargon-mired, based on insufficient evidence, and accountability-driven rather than focused on improvement. Faculty engagement is essential, but unlike the wishful thinking expressed in Chuck's cult statement, that I think we're all in the room, maybe potentially in this cult, but not everybody is fully on board with the purpose, the meaning, and the importance of student learning assessment in the ways that we'll be working today. Some of the unanswered questions that came out of this project and some of the opportunities and challenges: how do we engage more faculty and engage them more fully? We did a survey in the exploratory phase of this project and found that 2/3 of our survey respondents said that their PFF programs already included some element of student learning outcomes and assessment of student learning. But those PFF programs, we know, address only a fraction of those who will become faculty. So maybe 10% of those from institutions that actually have PFF programs have this kind of exposure. How do we expand that? How do we move that sort of down the hall? How do we also engage TAs and other graduate students more meaningfully? So a lot of TAs are working in institutional contexts where they have very limited latitude and responsibility for the curricula. They may have a predefined curricula. They may also have limited exposure, limited opportunities to be teaching assistants. And so how do we provide these skills and exposure to those students who won't have those experiences? And then what are the operational challenges? Lack of centralized university support for student learning assessment in some campuses, overly mechanized requirements, and sometimes contradictory requirements between the university-driven efforts with respect to accreditation and program-driven assessment efforts. So now I'm going to turn to another project. This project took place in the context of trying to address two gaps, or actually really three gaps. One was that we found that in international collaborations, there were often graduate international collaborations. In other words, when graduate students were either in joint degree programs or dual degree programs or working overseas in a research collaboration, there were ethical issues that would come up in that research collaboration that were never addressed at the outset. We also have worked on responsible conduct of research and research ethics, and knew that there are a lot of curricula out there, but many of the curricula actually don't address those issues that arise in international contexts. So we proposed a project in which we would work with model institutions, such as Emory, Northern Arizona, University of Oklahoma, and Virginia Tech, to try to address this. And the reason why I'm bringing this project up is we took what we called a learning outcomes approach. And so our hypothesis was, if we could actually get people to be very strategic, faculty and students, engaged together in looking at rubrics and thinking about learning outcomes for what they would want to achieve at this intersection of research ethics and international collaboration, we can achieve several things. One would be greater faculty involvement and support of research ethics, because they'd actually be helping to define what issues arise. What are the issues that your students may be encountering that you're really not addressing? The other one would be to get students and faculty engaged in learning assessment and in talking about graduate learning assessment outside of the whole accreditation question. And that might have a generalizable sort of transferable effect on faculty amenability to engagement in learning assessment. Here are some of the unanswered questions, opportunities, and challenges that arose in this project. I guess the first one was just simply, how should learning outcomes be defined and used in an international collaborative context? We have these joint degrees, we have these research collaborations. There are European frameworks and European practices for learning outcomes. There are US frameworks and practices for learning outcomes, but we rarely do sort of crosswalk work when we have these international collaborations. Should we be doing crosswalk work? Is this an opportunity for more international dialogue about what we're doing when we send our students abroad or when we bring students in? A second question is, do cultural differences, for example, among students from different countries, in approaches to ethics merit different curricular or co-curricular experiences to achieve the same learning outcomes for all? One of the findings of the University of Oklahoma, one of the sort of research topics was really about how cultural differences, differences of national origin and the cultural differences from those national origins actually have a kind of inflection in the way students deliberate their ethical decision making. And what Oklahoma did is sort of then think, well, now how do we address these needs differently within the same context? And does this occasion sort of a different rubric for different populations? I think this is a more generalizable question for everybody about that reaches sort of the question of learning differences, right? And so you have different populations that may have different types of learning, styles of learning. And how are we in dialogue with that about our student learning outcomes? And then finally, what role should graduate students play in working with faculty to identify learning outcomes? I'm not sure how prominent this is in the national sort of picture, but what we'd heard from this project was this was the first time that in many of these campuses, graduate students and faculty worked together on learning assessment in ways that actually ended up benefiting the program's work on learning assessment. Now, finally, so those were sort of two projects that kind of talk about learning assessment more tangentially. And then the last project that I'm going to mention, this is with funding from the Lumina Foundation. This project addressed head-on the question of doctoral learning outcomes and frameworks for both the PhD and the professional doctorate. The purpose of this project was really to help Lumina think about the inclusion of the PhD in its beta credentials framework and its degree qualifications profile, but also to think about rollout and to think about communications and to think about advocacy strategies and to think about what some of the challenges might be if they actually are trying to roll up the PhD and the professional doctorate together and work with accreditors to throw up this instrument as potentially useful for work at the doctoral level. We did 3 commissioned papers for Lumina. We had a fall stakeholders workshop at which Natasha presented. We had a CGS, a member survey of our universities. We had focus groups with our deans as well as with accreditors. And we have a final report to Lumina that we will be making public in the next several months that really address the question of how would frameworks be valuable at the doctoral level, what purposes might they serve, and what are the challenges? So here, in terms of the context for this work, I'm just giving you tip of the iceberg. We've done a lot of research in this area. The first chart here, pie chart, shows what proportion of your PhD programs have developed student learning outcomes. So this comes from our member survey. And as you can see, only a quarter of those institutions said for most of our PhDs, we have done this. 40% said we've done this for all, and the rest are somewhere between none, not sure, a few. So this, we don't have deep dive information on this, and Natasha may have deeper dive information on what this actually looks like. But our sense from our work with our members is that much of this has been driven in anticipation of the increasing attention of accreditors, accrediting bodies, on student learning outcomes, even at the doctoral level. So then we asked the accrediting bodies, do you put forward guidelines specifically related to assessment at the doctoral level? And as you can see, the majority of those who responded said professional doctorates only. About a quarter said both research and professional doctorates. And 20% or so said we do not have any national guidelines for at the doctoral level. So in our work, we had dialogue with our deans about how frameworks might be used to inform the work of producing student learning outcomes at the doctoral level. And then we had a lot of discussion about what's the terminology, and is student learning outcomes the right terminology, or is it something else that would actually get faculty more engaged in this process? And I'm leaving sort of aside the whole vocabulary, communication, terminology question. But the feedback that we got here about how a framework might be used, and frameworks are sort of typically transdisciplinary statements of competencies and proficiencies at the degree level that could be then used at the program level to articulate specific learning outcomes. So the first, well, several of these are to raise the level of conversation around program purpose and degree requirements, to serve as a corrective when faculty appear only interested in doctoral students as research and teaching assistants and not necessarily as learners, to serve as a quality check amid a proliferation of doctoral degrees, and to foster more transparency to students, faculty, and the public, whether about milestones, sort of trying to move the implicit expectations many faculty have about the milestones, and, well, I know it when I see it, when a dissertation is done, and moving that more into the explicit so that students can understand what expectations those faculty may have. To encourage clear and consensus definition of the value of the PhD, and combat perceptions, even public perceptions of the PhD as arcane. And to more clearly articulate and demonstrate the value of investments in doctoral education. So this is almost unreadable. This probably is for you unreadable, and I think that says something about this work that we've done on frameworks, that we ended up probably with more questions than answers about the degree to which frameworks such as the degree qualification profile are kind of ready to go for use at the PhD level. But I'm raising all of these questions to sort of intentionally frustrate, but also enable those of you who are sort of going into the day with questions about what you'll be doing at the graduate level and the doctoral level. But first, the first and biggest question that I think we're all asking is sort of whose degree is it? Whose learning expectations should student learning outcomes articulate and express? Is it that of our faculty? Those are our students, our employers, TAs, or others. One of the typical conversations that you might have is that, well, we anticipate that our faculty will have some resistance, but we're going to convey to them, well, no, you already have these expectations. We just want you to make them explicit. Just write them down, put them in a different format. And some of the pushback on that conversation is, well, what if your faculty at the doctoral level, for example, say, well, we want all of our students to go teach at Research One universities in tenure-track positions? And you say, okay, we'll articulate that. Well, what if your students say, well, I'm actually in this PhD program not to go to a R1 institution in a tenure-track position. I want to use my degree to go join a nonprofit organization and direct national projects. And as we've we're working on through a project on career outcomes to actually track the data, we're also working in a professional development program to try to help universities better understand how many students are actually taking their PhDs and taking them in very different directions, and to what extent should the programs be in dialogue with those directions and those aspirations as they're articulating their learning outcomes. So some of the other questions are, can a single framework encompass both a PhD and a professional doctorate? Or because there are already such clearly articulated expectations by many accreditors for licensing requirements, for example, do we really need something that encompasses both professional doctorates and PhDs? Do we need two sets of frameworks? Should frameworks define common elements essential to all doctorates? Or are these really kind of a menu of options that programs are supposed to use, tailor, and choose? And to what extent do our learning outcomes encompass co-curricular experiences? In other words, not just what's going on in the program per se, but in the broader program. That is the experience that a student will have during the years in which they're attending their program that may come from career services, it may come from graduate school hosted events, it may come from other activities. So these are just a few of the questions. You can see the other question. I'm happy to make this available if the organizers are going to make these available. I'm also happy to get a copy of our publications that I've presented here to anybody who would just leave a card or let me know of their interest. So I'll just close by saying I hope that some of this has been provocative, and that some of this has been destabilizing, because I really think that it's part of the purpose of this opening framing, both to give you confidence and give you a set of ideas to get to work on, but also to sort of raise questions that should be in the back of your mind so that we don't get into our nuts and bolts work focusing on the bolts, but keep in mind the broader questions and the broader purpose of what we're here for. So I wish you all luck. I hope you BAM it. And I don't know if do we have time for any questions?
Just a quick question out of curiosity. The project that you just described for the doctoral programs, it includes PhD and EDDs?
Yes.
Or is basically PhDs?
No, it's PhDs and professional doctorates, and it would include the
Okay. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Alice Tomlin. I'm the Director of Research at the Teaching and Learning Transformation Center at the University of Maryland, College Park. Natasha, I had a question for you. I was very interested in your 4 perspectives, and I have to admit that I probably fall more into the measurement perspective. And it seemed like from your stories about assessment that you were more interested in qualitative assessment than quantitative assessment, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on maybe mixed methods or how to incorporate quantitative assessment while remaining student-centered and learning-centered.
Yeah.
Hello.
Can I talk to you?
Yes.
We're a team.
It's not on either.
Thanks. Did I turn you off?
There you go.
I figured out this thing. I feel good about myself. I'm a technology person. No, I think that's a great question. And I'm going to give you sort of a non-answer, just as a heads up. But I think learning is incredibly complex. And one of the things that we've been afraid to do is embrace the complexity. And a lot of our assessment measures reflect that. We have had sort of an approach to the things that are measurable that we can agree on in a variety of ways, and that misses a lot of things in spaces. So I would say mixed methods is a really good way to go. Most of the things that we want are integrated and comprehensive and have our students applying in multiple situations, and especially when you're thinking like capstone experience, when you need to be able to pull in all of these learning in a very dynamic and different way where you're defining the problem and all of those sorts of pieces that really matter, I think, to keep our students engaged and motivated and to give the best demonstration of their learning. I think we can be overly, can't come up with a positive word right now, so I can't. We can be overly demanding, I think, in some ways about forcing learning into measurement boxes that hinder actually getting students excited about the learning that we want them to demonstrate, and thinking very broadly and innovatively about ways that they can be showcasing their work and those pieces. And so I think there has actually been a lot of really nice work in something that some refer to as like assessment science, which is a lot of the measurement conversation. James Madison University has tons of really great research on sort of measurement pieces, and I think, especially even in like curriculum mapping and assignment design, we have to be very mindful of measurement pieces, because otherwise we build a house of cards. and you have major validity issues if this thing is not like that thing. And so these are really important questions to figure out, but we do need to have a much more wider embrace of what counts as evidence and at what sort of level of our agreement that it's okay. So is that a yes answer? Okay.
Okay, more questions, ideally from this corner of the room, so Monica has to go all the way across. Oh, okay, all right.
I'll ask us.
Here, all the way over there.
All the way over here. I can share their microphone. This is actually a question for the speakers, but a challenge to the group, and it's a selfish question. We have 12 institutions, the bulk of the public higher education system in the state of Maryland represented here. We are ultimately interested in individual student outcomes, and we all know individual stories make often the best stories. But we need to be able to do our best to open this up and roll up the assessments that we have from each one of the campuses, because often we have a platform and an audience at the state level that would reinforce and enhance the outcomes you have. So could you address that possibly? This may be somewhat different than some of the other conferences that you usually speak to at one institution. But I challenge all of you to help us figure out how we can tell your stories better.
Yeah. I feel like I need a whiteboard for this. So I'm going to talk with my notes just so I can speak with this. I'm sorry. So we had, when we were first sort of thinking about doing assessment, right, we looked at students where they came in, we figured out where to put them, and then we didn't really look at them again until the end. And then that was sort of like our program check. We also had, as Dana was sort of alluding to at one point, 2 systems of assessment operating, one that was a program that was like actually useful, we changed stuff with it, and then one that was institution level that were like, I don't know how that data connects to what I'm doing in my program, I don't know where it goes. They went out to some reporting, and not having those two connect causes a lot of problems about our ability to tell our unique story, to talk about our students and how they move and thinking about those things in that way. So one of the things we've been seeing as people have been engaging, I think, in this next iteration, you think of this as waves of assessment conversations, and I don't know what wave we're in. We can have that conversation maybe throughout today, maybe we can name it, come up with it, we'll write a paper, it'd be great. But I think we're in a current wave now that's going, how does this look as a collective whole, which is a very different lens to have on it. And it's also that individual student. It's not enough to say, well, some of them get it, or we look in our programs doing okay. It's like, how do we know that every single learner is leaving with the things that we want them to have? And that's a very different question. It's a very different way to collect data. How is data? You see like the boom of vendors and assessment management systems that a lot of them, the first iteration, data archives, talk to your librarians, they know how to like navigate that stuff. But that's what they were made for, was to house all of these things and like to pulling out reports. And I think some have been more responsive and gotten better than others. But what you see with that shift to the individual student is the need to say, okay, here they are, but I need touch points along the way, right? So now I have a lot of formative, embedded, course-based assessment happening, where I'm asking like this assignment is connected to these things, or this demonstration that I'm asking my students to engage with goes. So I have all these touch points, and I have opportunities for my students to change what they're doing. You see some institutions start to do like a competency-based or a sort of advising tool that says like, you took these courses and you did really well on these learning outcomes, but you're struggling here. So when you're looking at your elective, pick one that has a learning outcome that covers that area that you're struggling. Very different way of thinking about advising. Also, like, we forget to involve advisors in our conversations about our learning outcomes, but that's another thing. But so that shift to having to look along the way and move so that we know where they are. Very different data collection need, but very different way to roll up to how does that talk about the institution. Because what's behind that is this idea that if this is what we're all going for in our institution, this is part of our mission, then somehow our program connects to that. Somehow our courses are related to that. Somehow what I'm asking students to do in my course, in the form of an assignment, is related to that too. And if all those points hold, then I can roll it up to start talking about a picture of our learning as an institution in a very different way, but I can also drill down to give you those examples of an individual learner and an individual student and a specific learning experience. Have we figured out how to do that well? Not really. There are some examples, I think, in the play of how that's going. But But that is a newer shift and one that's happening, and I think very positive to get to the kinds of learning and things that we need, and also one that's very helpful at the graduate level when we have huge retention issues, right? And we're losing our students and why. And how are we thinking about that, and where are those support pieces of touch points along the way to prepare them? So I'll just say yes, really good question, and if you guys can become like the example of that, happy to help you if I need those to talk about in the field. So let's make you the system that figures this out.
And I'm open to others' contributions to this as well, but now I've had some time to consider my answer. And I think in working with graduate deans, as you saw, so many of our leaders in the graduate education community are really thinking about learning outcomes assessment in terms of two things. Like one is students, right? How do we ensure that our students are learning? But as you were suggesting as well, how do we demonstrate to the public, to our legislators, that we're making a difference, that we're making this difference. And it's not just about accountability to accredited bodies. This is about showing the public that what we're doing is worth your investment. It's worth your sending tax dollars. It's worth your spending tuition dollars. And so that value, I think something that you have that's an advantage by bringing people together as a system is that that value question becomes less abstract and it becomes much more specific. How does our institution contribute to this bigger piece of preparing, educating people in the state of Maryland? And I think that's a dialogue you're going to have. It's going to be enriched by bringing this group together. That wouldn't take place if you were merely having this as a virtual dialogue, much less not having it at the state level at all. So I think today is a great occasion to also be asking, as you are, how can leaders take advantage of the work that you're doing today and work to advance this, the results of this publicly.
Other questions? Tom, in the back. So, Natasha, you told the story of your seatmate who learned absolutely nothing in university, and many of the things I learned, I only realized I learned several years after I learned them, when I could put them into practice.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether the both of you would comment on the importance of tracking alumni after the event, because I'm concerned that the assessment stops the moment they leave us.
Yeah.
When in fact the expression of that outcome is going to occur many years down the road.
Yeah. I think sorry. Did that hurt your ears? Sorry, I feel you guys now. I think that's a great question, and it reminds me of this backstory that was like, I'm not interested in what they're getting out of my class. I want that they're out on a balcony looking at the sunset and it all hits a moment. And I was like, that's kind of creepy. But I think because we want both, right? We need both. And it's really important to take a look at our alumni. And I think this is especially important in Gen Ed. There's a great example. It's St. Olaf College, OLAF, where they have this don't just check off the requirements, where they have alumni and employers that talk about why Gen Ed matters and what they thought that they apply and use in this work. And they have these like little posters that they put all around. And so anytime people are like, what does this matter? They're like, here's why. And it's pulling from the alumni group to really make that case and talk about it. But it's sort of a two-part thing. One, people say they didn't learn things because they think that what we wanted them to learn was the content. Right? So it's talking about, I don't remember the year an event happened. I don't remember really the difference between supply and demand. It's a really terrible example. So insert your own example there that makes much more sense. But it's that content piece, and it's missing that it's through the content that we're getting to these outcomes, and that it's yes, content is important, and it's not that we're giving that up, but it's the content is a vehicle by which we get to these larger, transferable, sort of transient in some ways, learning outcomes, and it's that communication piece I think that's missing. Also, I think speaking to that it's something that you don't really get until later, which we've seen with the employer conversation. It's been fascinating to us when we talk with employers to get down to doing. What is it you actually ask the person to do? Like you say, because we do a lot of the do you like these learning outcomes, employer group? Yeah. You want some graduates to do that? Awesome, we'll get you something. Like that's our conversation. And then they're going, oh, we didn't get it, and now we still have the skills gap and all these things, right? But once you get past the language and you get into that, like, what is it that you actually really want them to do? And I'm asking them to do this in this assignment. What am I missing here? What's that missed opportunity for demonstration so that they can get that additional sort of piece that makes it that real world, authentic experience? And they're like, oh, I would add in this. A perfect example, and I'm so sorry, Dan, very quickly, was a public relations assignment where they were having to do prep for an event, and they were like, but you're not preparing any of your students to deal with an incident. I need them to deal with an incident. And so when the students would get up, and what they did to change the assignment was the students would get up, do the presentation, talking about it. So it's like bringing orphans to a Humane Society event, and they're doing it, but a dog bites a kid. Right in the middle of your doing your presentation. You have 30 seconds to figure out how you fix it. Right? And putting that into the assignment, like no one got bit, don't freak out. Some people are like, oh, no, it's an assignment. Added that additional layer so that they're getting that practice of the things in the course before they get out to do it. So they're starting to make those connections, which gives us a better opportunity to capture some of that learning, but also enables our students to talk about it in different ways with employers. But I'll just say we're not going to get all of it, and especially not the civic pieces and some of the ethic pieces and all of those elements that are really important that take time, the scaffold in learning. We're making lifelong learners in a lot of ways. Learning is life-wide, I think is one way someone was talking about it. And we do need to be mindful of capturing that because we also have a lot of our students that come back. And having those relations with our alumni can really help us figure out meaningful ways how to engage them in that conversation and what their needs are as this work moves. So yes, to all of that in a very long-winded way. Sorry.
So I think I mentioned in passing that we're launching a huge project on career pathways. And so for PhDs, for starting with PhD students, we're working with, I don't remember how many institutions we have, more than 20, I think something like 30, 34, 35 institutions, and plus additional unfunded institutions to track career pathways of their PhDs. This is just focused on jobs, careers, and then the experiences that they had in their graduate programs that informed their success, that contributed to their pathways. It's very hard work, even if you're just not focused on the civil or the civic, but just focused on the career paths. Very hard work, literally, to track people. And of course, we're not just trying to track them, we're trying to get their stories, and we're trying to get stories not just about where they are or where they came from, but what they think those defining moments were in their educational experiences. And then ultimately use those tales and that data to redesign and inform and enhance our programs. It's even harder at the undergraduate level. And I had some experience with the Humanities Indicators Project. I don't know if you know about this. It was a really rich project, in some sense a kind of commonplace book of all the data sets that would inform what we know about the impact of humanities education. And one of my early frustrations with the project was that it was very linear. So it was like saying, if you had an English major, or an art history major, we're going to look at art museums, we're going to look at journals where you'd be an editor, some very linear pathways, but we're not taking account those English majors who are now CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, or those English majors who are at law firms and heading up incredibly important civil rights litigation. So I think mapping those nonlinear pathways, again, even if we're just trying to track their careers, is very, very difficult, very worthwhile. And aside from data collection efforts, I think just getting people's stories, whether it's through the National Academy's database of stories. The Council of Graduate Schools has a grad impact website where we have students telling their stories about their graduate experience and their research and how they're making a difference. I think getting even some of these less systemic efforts, but getting them more visible and getting more people to be participating and aware of these is hugely important, both for conveying the importance to our legislators of what we're doing, but also conveying back to our teachers the difference that they're making.
I think we're out of time.
I was going to say, if you want an arts example that's really good at this, look at the SNAP project. It's the Strategic National Alliance of the Arts project. Their dashboard website's awesome.
Thank you. We're going to continue to tag team with a lot later. Thank you. Let's give Natasha and Daniel another round of applause.
Hi, my name is Natasha Jankowski. I'm director of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment and a faculty member at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign.
All right, and what influences you to travel to other universities and spread your message?
Well, I think part of it is our work. Students learn everywhere, and we need to be out and about and seeing where people are struggling and where they aren't. And assessment is a field. You could easily get into doing research without talking with the people doing the work on the ground and have less of an impact or a meaningful understanding of what questions people have and what challenges are shared. And so for us, it's very much needing that national perspective. Everyone needs to be able to see themselves in our work. And so we need to get out and talk and make sure that we have a good understanding and are being meaningful and impactful for where people are.
In your eyes, what is the importance of Bowie State University being a part of the university system of Maryland?
Well, university systems afford a lot of economies, is one way that I would put it. It means we have a group of sister institutions with whom we can collaborate, consult, and do a better job of providing higher educational opportunity for all the people of the state of Maryland.